My name is Dr. Deirdre Hart and I'm a coastal scientist here at the University of Canterbury. My specialty is working across boundaries. So coastal environments are interfaces between land and sea. They're also interfaces between fluvial drainage systems, so rivers, and draining the land out to sea. And I'm involved in the Hazards Project looking at the intersections of environments and boundaries. With regard to the Multi-Hazards Project, that's inherently the kind of work that I do as a coastal scientist, because we look at how different sorts of aspects of the coastal environment interact. We've got sea level, and then we've got tides on top of sea level, and hazards like tsunami that come in on top of both of those factors. Then on the landward side, we've got sediment resources that provide nourishment for our beaches and barriers from some hazards. But we've also got drainage systems wanting to get water out, and when it can't get water out, we've got flooding on land. The Coastal Quakes project, the Super Tide project that I'm working with in the Multi-Hazards Lifelines project, my perspective is inherently looking at the intersections between environments, and that includes the built environment. Sonia Giovanazzi and I are working on a collaborative project between earth scientists and engineers looking at lifelines infrastructure and multi-hazards. Our perspective on multi-hazards is not just to look at the layering of a number of hazards which affect one geographic area, but to really look at the interactions between the hazard. So if you have an earthquake which changes and deforms the land, it lowers some parts of a drainage system and it raises other parts of the drainage system. It changes river channel cross sections and therefore the flow capacity of the rivers and the coast. So we've had relative sea level rise effectively wrought by the earthquakes. We're looking at all of these different hazards and how they interact with the earthquake effects. But you could do this for any hazard. It's not earthquake specific. It's just looking at when you have one major hazard event, what happens to all of the other hazard vulnerabilities. And one thing that we're finding is that after a major hazard event, any major hazard event, one thing that you need to do is to reassess all of your other hazard vulnerabilities. Another thing that you'll hopefully do in hindsight is to think about hazards in series. So instead of thinking about hazards as parallel, separate aspects of your landscape, you think about the connections. The flooding earthquake connections are very obvious. So we've had changes in river channels, as I said, we've had lowering of the land. But you also need to think about things like tsunami vulnerability, which may not seem immediately connected. Because we've had relative sea level rise, in other words, we've had a lowering of the land relative to the sea level that we had before and after the earthquakes, we've now had the configuration of our coast adjusted, and the sediment resources that we had are now at a different elevation to what they were before the earthquakes. Another aspect of the multi-hazard study we're very keen on investigating is looking at groundwater levels. Now the land is closer to the groundwater levels in some areas of the city. The groundwater has been elevated compared to the surface of the land. And that's going to go on changing with climate change induced sea level rise. We're going to get the groundwater creeping up underneath the city. This has big implications for future earthquakes because of liquefaction. So the recipe for liquefaction in general terms is saturated ground with the right kinds of sediments, and then you accelerate the movement of those sediments. You liquefy the sediments by shaking. If you have a very low water table, you're relatively safe from liquefaction. If you've raised the water table, then zones that were perhaps not vulnerable to liquefaction before this earthquake will be newly vulnerable to liquefaction in the future. If you then on top of that have sea level rise and the groundwater table creeps upwards, you're going to have ongoing new areas of liquefaction vulnerability. And for us that in Canterbury, that means the areas out west, the boundaries of liquefaction are spreading west. Another implication of climate change on top of an earthquake event is the drainage system has changed. So parts of our city are much more low-lying, and some areas are close to or below sea level. So some of our river mouths are not functioning very effectively as drains, and we're limited in what kind of solutions we can apply in those areas. You can't dredge out river channels when they're in the coastal area and they're already at or below sea level to allow water to drain out, because effectively you're just allowing seawater back up the river channels.
So here we're looking at part of our city's drainage network. We're in the lower Avon, not very far from the coast, and water levels are very high in this area on the high tide, and you can see during floods and high tides where that water's coming to. But to my left here, we've got water coming out of a tributary into the Avon, and we've got culverts which are having difficulty draining out because the water levels are so high. At the moment, we're on the lowest possible tide, so you can imagine the scenario here when you have a high tide, when you've got rainfall and flooding, how blocked up this drainage system gets.
So you really need to look at all of the hazards influencing one environment to understand the implications for the future. And we're hoping to influence planning decisions. So where there are decisions around existing development and the infrastructure that's put back in, or how the infrastructure is recovered, rebuilt in those areas, do we need a change of system? Should we be putting that infrastructure back in? Should we be supporting those settlements, or should we be looking at more of an adaptive migration of part of our settlement? And that really has implications for greenfield sites. So a lot of areas that have not been developed are being rezoned, and we're trying to look at where it's sensible for those redesigning decisions to be residential or for other purposes based on a multi-hazards perspective.